public sex in Korea. The term public sex is one brought up by Sarah No in her book, The Comfort Woman, which we'll come to a little bit later. But it sort of encompasses the idea that within the Confucian society, although family is paramount and the structure is the way that society functions, men of a certain level of status are still entitled to, and in some cases biologically need, a sexual outlet outside of their marriage, that's something that they have a right to by virtue of their status. So I'm taking a look at this idea over the span of Korean history, from traditional ideas of kisang all the way up to modern Korea, and specifically Korean. Okay, so kisang in Korea are often compared to geisha in Japan, and there are a number of similarities to the structure, but also some differences. But kisang themselves were professional entertainers. They were generally from the lower echelons of society and were brought into a guild where they were educated in music and dance and conversation and embroidery, and were professional entertainers for the court and nobility. So they had a significantly higher status in society than, say, their mothers did, but they also had no status in society. They were officially non-existent because there's no way to fit them into a Confucian ideal. So as official non-entities, they couldn't marry, they couldn't establish households of their own. There wasn't any way for them to obtain status or property the way a marriage would for a woman who was not a kisang. But they also had sort of strange elements of freedom. They were much more educated than any other Korean women, including upper-class women. And they were able to express themselves through music and dance and poetry in ways that other women were simply not able to do. So it's this very strange dichotomy between the power that they had socially and the lack of power that they had culturally, or maybe the other way around. They were also officially considered slaves of the government from 1650 all the way up to 1895. And so if, for example, a nobleman fell in love with one of them and wanted to marry her or take her as an exclusive mistress, he had to purchase her from the government, and the cost of that was prohibitive. So it very rarely actually happened. And throughout this span of time, all through the Joseon era, there is this tension going on between the idea that we need kisang in society versus the idea that we can't have kisang in society because it's immoral. But kisang did continue as an official institution all the way through this, 2.5 years, because of what they were seen to accomplish for society. Firstly, they supplied intellectual companionship for upper-class men. So for the king and the nobility, their wives were not educated. They were not expected to converse. They were not expected to be interesting or challenging in any way, and the kisang were. So men couldn't be friends with their wives, but they could have interesting and compelling friendships and relationships with kisang. And they were also considered necessary to prevent rape of upper-class women. Going back to this idea that there is a biological need for men to have sex outside of a marital context, and if they don't get it in some official sanctioned way, they're going to get it in a legitimate way. So kisang are there as a safety valve on society to protect their betters, upper-class noble women, from unwanted attentions of men. And officially, kisang did not have a sexual role. They weren't technically licensed prostitutes. Any sexual relations with kisang were done under the table. They were officially court entertainers. But because they didn't technically exist, they had no actual power, and so their handlers, their patrons could demand sexual favors, and there wasn't much that an individual could do about it. But we have a record of some of the poetry that they wrote. They're considered great repositories of cultural heritage through music and dance. And of course, a lot of that is ephemeral. We don't have a written record of it, but they were able to preserve so much of this tradition, passing down from, in a sort of master to apprentice kind of way within the guild of Keesing. And we do have written records of some of their poetry. So this is one that I picked out. Who caught you, fish, then set you free within my garden pond? Which clear northern sea did you leave for these small waters? Once here, with no way to flee, you and I are the same. Then an alternative text here. I have a will like a blue mountain. His love for me is a green running stream. Shall a blue mountain change with the rushing of green waters? He will not forget this blue mountain. His green cries resound as he goes. So I really liked juxtaposing these two poems because the first, if I figure out how to get back there we go, is this narrative of powerlessness of a young woman who has been taken away from her home and brought into a glamorous but very confining life and is relating to the fish in the same situation. But Huang Jini here is giving this narrative of power, that she is a mountain and her aristocratic lover is a running stream, that they interact, but she's more powerful than him and causes him to suffer. So there is still this dynamic of Keesing being helpless, but at the same time extremely powerful and influential. Then comes Japan. There's a really cool story, I like it, of back in the Japanese invasion in the 1590s, there's a folk tradition of a Keesing named Junonge, who, after the Japanese invaded and were having a celebration, they ordered Keesing entertainers, and this very patriotic woman seduced the general, Kiyamura Rokusuke, I cannot pronounce Japanese at all, seduced him and brought him with her to the edge of a cliff, embraced him, locked her rings together behind his back, and jumped off the cliff to kill him by murder-suicide. So there is, again, this idea of the power of Keesing that comes through in this particular story. But as Japan comes in as a colonial occupying force, they sort of take over the institution of the Keesing and use it as an instrument of colonization. So the picture here is of a young woman in a training school for Keesing. So she's learning to paint, doing brush painting. And this was put in place of the traditional guild structure. So Keesing, instead of learning the songs and music and poetry from their older sisters in the guild, they're learning more Japanese arts and traditions from instructors brought over from Japan. So instead of, this girl is still wearing hanbok, but as the occupation went on, Keesing were generally not seen in hanbok anymore, they were seen in kimono. Because they were there for the pleasure and entertainment of the Japanese officials, predominantly. And lost my train of thought. So there's this question of mimicking the Japanese that comes up again in this narrative later on. But as Japan starts its wars of conquest across the Pacific, the Keesing are among the first to be recruited as wianbu, or comfort women. So they're gathered together and shipped off to the war front, where they're used as military prostitutes. And again, this comes back to this assumption of necessary public sex. The Japanese military supplied brothels to their troops out of the military budget on the assumption that men need sex, they're away from their wives, and is going to cause problems with the people we're invading if our soldiers are raping everyone all the time. So they provide, and it's quite explicit in a lot of the narratives, that they've provided these brothels the same way that they provide public lavatories, that it's a biological function that needs to be controlled so that people don't get sick. onto this narrative of the comfort women. It sort of starts with the Kising, but expands to women from all over Korea, mostly low class. The numbers are very sketchy because Japanese officials don't want a lot of it known, but they range from low estimates of about 50,000 women to upper estimates of about 200,000 Korean women that were recruited as comfort women, as military prostitutes during the war. The number is particularly high here because Korean women were considered terribly useful. They were as similar to Japanese women as you could get without being a Japanese woman. So, the Kising, or not the Kisings, the comfort women were generally paid for their services. A Japanese woman would be paid the most, Korean woman about 3/5 that, and she'd be making significantly more than, say, a Filipina. And inasmuch as this is a public health measure, the women all have regular medical exams. The soldiers are encouraged to use condoms so that they don't catch venereal disease from the comfort women. This is now considered to be a drastic human rights crime, and from the 90s on, we've been playing this blame game of whose fault was the comfort women movement. And we like to straight up blame the Japanese military, and there's a strong nationalist element behind this. Koreans love to blame the Japanese because we can blame the Japanese. But the story is more complicated than that. There's this wonderful image that we have of Japanese soldiers going into a peasant house and like dragging the daughter out by her hair, but in fact that happened very rarely, if at all. Mostly the people who were recruiting these women to be shipped off as comfort women were Korean. Korean men making their living as comfort procurers. So they go through villages and talk about jobs in Japan, get a group of women together, put them on a boat, and ship them up to China or out to the Philippines. Women were also knowingly sold by their families as comfort women, and some ran away from home because they were looking for jobs and ended up kidnapped that way. But Korean society had just as much to do with this as Japanese society did. Also, the comfort women themselves took a lot of blame at the time, less so now, I hope, but a lot of them after the war refused to go home because they knew that they would be socially ostracized, and even those that did go home were very reluctant to talk about their experiences, primarily because any thriving in this environment could be seen as consent. So one of the accounts that Sarah So collected was a woman who, in the Philippines for many years, was a comfort woman and actually advanced to be a brothel mistress. She had a regular lover that she was very much in love with, and then when she came back to Korea, her life was miserable. She was branded forever as a Japanese living whore. And when she died, she asked that her ashes be scattered at the island where she was again. So it's a very complicated story, and we like to play the blame game. But I gotta throw in here, American GIs were also complicit, not necessarily in the Japanese camps, but once the Japanese moved out, the American GIs moved right in, and a vast number of Rianmu who had been compelled to do the service for the Japanese military moved into doing it for the American military because there was a market and they had nowhere else to go. So it wasn't as official as slavery, but it was still there because Americans like to do things by economics. So as Korea sort of rebuilt its economy, we get this idea of sex tourism. And again, it's all economic. In Japan, the cost of prostitution is rising and quality is seen to be declining. So the women in the red light district aren't like the geisha of yore. So Japanese men who have this thriving economy as well and money to burn head over to Korea to engage in prostitution there. So in the 1960s and 70s, 80% of all tourists to Korea were Japanese. And of those Japanese, 98% of them came to Korea in men-only parties. This isn't even counting men who are coming with their wives, their daughters. So it was a large and official thing, and the Korean government actively encouraged it because it was a way to bring in a lot of very stable Japanese currency. And while that's going on, you've still got the military bases in America that have camp towns around them that thrive for decades and decades with prostitutes catering to American soldiers. Again, bringing dollars into the economy. And so in this particular window, prostitution is seen as almost patriotic. So it has this government support, and the idea is that prostitutes catering to foreign men are doing their country a service by boosting the economy. And during this period, in the mid-70s, like 5% of Korea's GDP was sex tourism. In 1973, things start to get a little sour as predominantly women start protesting sex tourism at the airport. There's a big protest in 1973, and it's not necessarily about the sex tourism, it's more anti-Japanese. But there is a nationalist element to this. We don't want to be the country of Japanese living whores. So eventually in 1994, prostitution was officially outlawed in Korea, but it is still very prominent. The estimates are it's now 1% of the GDP. And places that you can obtain sex they have covers as norebang, so karaoke bars, massage parlors, coffee shops, and barber shops, where they have an official title as a coffee shop or a barber shop, but it's understood in the community that you go there for sexual services. Meanwhile, kind of contradictorily, the traditional arts of kiseng, so the dance